So welcome to Language, Culture, and Dr. Lou. And this little live stream, I want to talk about some cultural things as per usual. And I wanted to do a little less politics this time than I did last week or the week before, because I don't want my channel to be all politics and whatnot. I do enjoy talking about culture. Um, a little more, and that's a little more in my wheelhouse, given my training and education and my teaching. But anyway, I'll often end up getting wrapped up a little in politics, so I'll save the couple political things for later on in this live stream, because I'd like to get into talking about culture first. And by the way, these political things I'm talking about both have to do with how the whole Epstein Saga got reinjected into the media over the last week for a couple reasons. A, having to do with Pam Bondi, and B, having to do with Melania Trump. So we'll save those for a little later. So that yeah, we don't have to get so political right away. And so, but the one thing I wanted to talk about more than that was um, I saw a video last night that really made me think, because I recognized all of these so-called myths that were mentioned, and these are myths about the UK that Americans are told, that Americans generally believe. And well, for a large part anyway, not necessarily every single American, but I recognized each and every one of these as um, things I had heard about England and the UK and whatnot as an American, and it was good to hear somebody debunking a lot of them. And I looked into it a little bit myself after this, but the video I'm talking about is on the channel Tyler Rumble. It's one of the YouTube channels, and I do like to consume his content. Tyler there has two channels. One is called Tyler Bucket, where I think he does a lot more stuff where he reacts to and learns from content about Canada. And on Tyler Rumble, his other channel, it seems to focus a lot more on him reacting to videos about and learning about the United Kingdom. So that's where these so-called myths come from, is a video that he was reacting to. Just came out yesterday. Again, the channel is Tyler Rumble. If you want to check it out after this live stream, I would recommend it. And the title of the video he's reacting to is, and I quote, "Six Lies Americans Told About the UK." And then in parentheses, American reaction. So again, I've heard all of these things as an American. I can confirm that these are things that we hear a lot in the US. And the first one is interesting to me because it has to do with free speech. Because we in the US are super, hi, there in the chat, how's it going? And it has something to do with free speech that in the US we're very proud of, and often grow up thinking that we're unique in having that right to free speech, as if no other countries have it, but plenty of countries do. And so the so-called myth, the first one, is that there's no freedom of speech in the UK. And that strikes me as a little weird, because yeah, we pride ourselves on a free speech in the US, and so we might be under the impression that in the UK they don't have free speech, and it's true, they don't have the same constitution as us, so the First Amendment isn't the same thing there, but they do have something called freedom of expression, which is pretty much the same thing. It's in Article 10 of the Human Rights Act of 1998 for the United Kingdom. And it basically, yeah, it gives freedom of expression as a right for people. But it's a little more complicated than that because it's a so called qualified right, not an absolute right, which means it can be restricted by law to prevent things like violence and disorder, as well as stopping hate speech and protecting national security. So there are some limits to it. And one thing that the guy in the video brought up, not Tyler, I mean the guy hosting the original video that Tyler is reacting to, um, one thing he brought up is from his perspective, it seems like there's a lot more individual responsibility assigned to people in the UK. Sure, they've got their free speech, but it probably shouldn't be hate speech and it shouldn't be inciting violence against anybody, which seems reasonable enough to me anyway. And so, yeah, there's that. And why I think uh, this guy would be a good source, the guy who made the video that Tyler was reacting to, why I think he would be a good source is because he's an American. So he has lived in the US, grew up here and everything. And so he knows American ways and he knows what he hears from other Americans. But he's been living in the UK for at least 5 years now, so much that he's actually on his in the process of becoming a British citizen. So he has life experience in the UK too, and a good perspective on uh, the differences and similarities between life in both places. So again, the myth that there's no freedom of speech in the UK is pretty much false because they do have it. They just call it freedom of expression instead, pretty much. So that's the first part, and I thought that was interesting because, yeah, in the U.S. we are really proud of our free speech, and those of us who grew up in during the Cold War especially, were taught how our rights are especially special, and the freedom of speech is the most important of all, which I do believe that the First Amendment is super important, but yeah, we're not the only ones in this world who have free speech, and in the United Kingdom, they do. It's just called freedom of expression, pretty much. And so the second myth that the guy who made that video was debunking is that the city of London is really dangerous. And I could see that because London's a very big city, and oftentimes we think, oh, the larger the city probably means the more crime there is there, and so it's more dangerous and all that. I get that way of thinking. I kind of identify that as fairly solid train of thought, kind of reasoning anyway. But London, England, too, it's even bigger in population than New York City. New York City um, is, I think, a little under 9 million people. And whereas London is just shy, sort it's just shy of 10 million people. So it's a little bit larger than New York City, which is the biggest city in the US, the most populous one anyway. And so there's this reputation that maybe London is very dangerous, right? And the thing is, it got firmly debunked pretty much. If you do look at these statistics, it looks like London is statistically speaking, meaning safer, meaning you're less likely to be victim of a crime in London than in most of the cities in the US. So that to me is interesting. And I live in a city that's considered really small, Albany, New York, just about 100,000 people and whatnot. But we do have our own problems with violence and um, yeah, and so folks who live out in the country near here are always thinking of Albany as a super dangerous place to be. But But yeah, it's not always. And I think that's because of the same thing I was talking about earlier, where often folks think the larger the city, the more crime there is, so the more dangerous it is. Um, but yeah, it's um, yeah, not always true that way. And apparently, it seems like London would be a fairly safe city, and that sounds nice. I would really like to go there one day. I've never been to the United Kingdom. I have spent plenty of time in various parts of Europe, and I used to live in France for a little while. And so I know some stuff about Europe, well, continental Europe, but to me it's interesting to learn a little bit more about the UK as well. And I guess, well, the third so called myth I would like to talk about regarding um, regarding myths that Americans tend to believe about the United Kingdom. Hold on just a second. Sorry, trying not to cough too much in anybody's ear. And so the third myth that I found would be was an interesting debunking is that knife crime in the UK is really bad. And this I have heard from people in the US, from Americans, and mostly it's people who are promoting the Second Amendment and the right to bear arms, meaning guns. And I've heard people saying that, oh, yeah, because they don't have guns over in England, then people are getting stabbed all the time. And so knife crime is really dangerous. And so that's why that would be a good reason to, um, own firearms, be part of the Second Amendment, asserting your Second Amendment rights there. But again, the stats don't really tell that same story. The statistics, if you look, depending on which stats you've seen, I've looked at a few sets of them from different resources that I would consider valid and probably reliable, but you're anywhere from 40 to 60% more likely to be stabbed to death in the United States than in the UK. And it's not just because we have a bigger population, we're talking per capita. And so that to me is kind of worrisome because that's not even including the uh, can't really use the G word too much on YouTube. People are saying pew pews anyway, but the crime with those shooting crimes and whatnot is also a bigger problem here in the U.S. So between the knives and the pew pews and all that, um, yeah, it means we're not really so much more likely to be unalived via knife or another way in the UK than in the US. And so that to me is well, a little worrisome. I don't like how sometimes we don't always feel so safe here. Anyway, and yeah, so that's the first three so-called myths that I wanted to talk about because I have heard each of the three of them before, and it was interesting to hear about some of the so-called facts in the matter, and also do a little looking stuff up on my own to confirm if what I was hearing was right or not. And so we're only halfway through that little list of myths. The fourth one, now, again, this was about six different so called lies that Americans are told. I'm calling them just myths. Um, Myths that Americans tend to believe about the UK. And so the next one is you pay a lot more taxes in the UK than you do in the US. And I'm mostly talking income tax here. I myself am not a property owner, so I don't have as much familiarity with property taxes and stuff like that. But um, the guy in the video, who again, he has lived and worked in the US as well as in the UK, and he sort of explained the tax system a little better than what I knew about it. And it turns out that, well, it's probably true for the most wealthy of people that in the UK you're going to get taxed more. Um, but average earners, people who you would call the working class and even middle class, we are probably not paying less taxes in the US than they would pay in the UK. And the way their tax system works apparently is that the first 12 and a half thousand pounds you earn, first 12,500 pounds you earn, and your income is tax free. And then after that, it's a progressive tax system where you get taxed given what bracket your total income falls into. And so, and the first bracket is only 20%. And that would be 20% of monies after the first 12,500 pounds, which is about $17,000. So imagine your first $17,000 that you earn and your income is tax free. And then you're paying 20% in the first tax bracket. So that would be somebody who's maybe earning, I would probably fall into the first tax bracket or maybe the second. But when when I looked at it, it looked like I would actually be probably paying slightly less taxes in the UK than in the US. And I think a big part of that, my thinking anyway, is that in the US, I'm not just paying federal income taxes, I'm also paying New York State income taxes. And I know depending on what state you live in, your state income taxes might be different. Like there are some states with no income tax, like Florida, for instance. And and to me, yeah, it sort of doesn't add up to for the average earner, and especially for the bottom half of earners. You're not going to be paying too much more in taxes, in income taxes anywhere in the UK. And that is interesting because that is often how um, people defend the US not having universal health care and not offering health care as a right to all our citizens. But it turns out in the UK, where they do have the universal health care thing, they still manage not to tax people too much more. And something related to income and whatnot is also the next myth number 5 that I wanted to talk about, which is that you make much less money in the UK than what you would make in the USA. And it was nice to hear somebody who is working in the UK and who's done the tax thing and the employment thing in both countries, because I find that a credible source. And he said, well, in some ways, it's kind of true that in the United Kingdom, you might be making somewhere like 70 to 75% in the UK of what, actually, I think what he said is 2/3 to 78%. Those are his quotes. So about 2/3 to 3/4 or something as much if you're working in the UK than in the US. And I'm sure that depends on what profession you're talking about exactly, right? It probably varies by profession. And again, by state in the US based on what the cost of living is. And speaking of cost of living, things balance out that way because of universal health care, so people aren't going broke just because they got sick with bad health insurance. And also in the UK, in most cities in the UK, the cost of living is lower than in a lot of American cities. And so that will totally balance out, right? And I found the same thing from when I was living in France. I wasn't making very much money quite a bit less than I'm making in the US exactly, but my life there was more comfortable. Like, I managed to make ends meet a lot easier, probably because of better um, public transportation and again, free healthcare and all of that. And of course, France also gets free higher education, so you're not getting out of college already riddled with a ton of debt that you can't uh, pay off. Um, oh, hi, Sunshine. So you're still at the mall, but you're listening. Well, glad to have you here anyway. I hope I'm not boring you. And again, so getting back to the point of how you make, how you're supposed to make much less money in the UK than in the US, you got to consider that things are going to balance out a little bit because you're not going to pay as much for a lot of different things, such as healthcare uh, and other things related to your cost of living. So yeah, and so that's how this guy was debunking that myth. And again, his video is called Six Lies Americans Are Told About the UK. Um, so you can check that one out too. It's right on YouTube. And the number six is used with is spelled in number form, not in word form. And so I thought all that was super interesting beyond the fact that there certainly is freedom of speech in the UK. They just call it freedom of expression instead of freedom of speech. I thought that was an interesting thing to know. And that supposedly knife crime is really bad and London's really dangerous, which both turn out not to be true if you look at the statistics. Because again, you're more likely to be unalived at knife point in the US than you would be in the UK. And then again, as well as the whole, maybe in the UK, they don't pay quite as much in taxes as we think of as Americans. And even though their income may be lower on average, it's things balance out because of the lower cost of living. So you don't really need quite as much money because your money is going a lot farther. And I'm not just mentioning that because a pound is worth more than a dollar again, but I'm talking about even when you take exchange rates into account, the cost of living is reported to be much lower in most cities in the UK than what we're used to in the US. And again, I don't like generalizing about all of the US because even financial things and whatnot, a lot of this depends on what state you're living in. Like I said, I live in New York State, and that's one of the more expensive states to live in. We're a high tax state, and anyway, not so good. But we don't get the benefits of free higher education or free universal health care or any of the things that I did enjoy so much while I was in France. Um, and that apparently in the UK you also have lower cost of living, probably because it's worked out on a bunch of different levels. Now, the last so-called myth about the UK that a lot of Americans believe, and this one I've heard as well, I've heard this one too, is that British food is really bad. And like I said way earlier, I haven't been to the UK, but I have heard that rumor that their food is really bad, and I know they probably do have some dishes like black pudding. To me, seems, well, not to make a pun, but off-putting. It seems like it might not be the most delicious thing, so I get that. But then again, I mean, the Brits do, they have French fries and everything. They don't call them fries, they call them chips, but still, they got fries and all that. And as an American, I do like my fries. And, but so again, the guy in the video that I'm mentioning, he brought up something called Sunday roast, which is kind of like, okay, if you think that's really disgusting, then you must not like Thanksgiving either, because it's really good in that way. And and so I thought that was interesting. You can certainly point to certain dishes as being really good individually. So who are we to just give up on their whole entire cuisine without trying to get a little familiar with it? And I do. That's one thing I do like to do while traveling, is I'm always tasting local food, seeing that what their cuisine is like, and always trying a few different kinds of the local cuisine. And oddly enough, another thing I like to do when traveling, no matter what country I am in, I try to check out what their pizza is like. Because lots of places do have pizza, and it's often a very different experience depending on what country you're in. And I would say the worst pizza I've had for any given country would be in, I think that was Lithuania we were in at the time, when my friend ordered a sausage pizza, and it came out seeming kind of like a store brand, kind of like Elio's though, with like hot dog pieces chopped up on it. And I was like, well, that makes sense. Hot dog is, I guess, a kind of sausage, but to me, grossed me out. But on the other hand, also in the Baltics, Estonia had really good pizza, pretty good wood-fired pizza. I would actually recommend that. Anyway, but yeah, so he was debunking the myth that British food is really bad, and one of the things he mentioned is that because they have a very high population of Indians, because it is a more diverse country than many Americans might believe. They have a lot of good curry dishes. So apparently, the Indian immigrants to the UK brought their curry with them, and so apparently, it's really possible to find good curry dishes in the UK. And I would like to give that, yeah, to test that out if I do go to the UK someday, which I'm sure I will. Just a matter of when I will make it over there. And uh, the funniest thing that I heard during the debunking of the fact that British food, that there's an American myth that British food is terrible, um, he was sort of poking fun at the US, just reminding me again, he is an American living in the UK for a long time, but American by birth and by growing up and all that. And he reminded the viewers that America is the home of fast food. So we're not really so well known around the world for having super fine cuisine, having super great cuisine. And a lot of folks around the world, I do believe, think of fast food when they think American food, because you know there's McDonald's in lots of places around the world. You'd be surprised to all the places I have found McDonald's and Burger King and stuff. Although it's not like I'm looking for fast food while I'm traveling, I'd rather have local cuisine. But yeah, they are around, and we Americans, we do really like our fast food. We really do, and I can't say that I don't enjoy the taste of a lot of it, but I do try to avoid it because I'm a little too chubby, in my opinion, and it's not so great for your health. And so I do try to avoid it, but that's only a decision I made when I was already an adult and whatnot. And so, yeah, so that's the just, I'm going to recap again, but that's the 6 months that were debunked, that a lot of Americans do believe it about the UK. First, it's a myth that there's no freedom of speech, and mostly it's just because they call it freedom of expression. But it is a right there. And the second would be that London is really dangerous, which turns out not to be true because statistically speaking, it's safer London, England, even though it's got nearly 10 million people, which is more than any city in the US. It's statistically safer than most American cities to be in and to live in. So that's interesting to me. And the third one again is that knife crime in the UK is really bad. And it turns out you're more likely to be a victim of, stabbing and being unalived by knife um, in the United States and in the UK, not just by a little, by 40 to 60%. Anyway, and then number four was that you'll pay more taxes in the UK than in the US, which turns out only to really be true for the most wealthy individuals, the people whose income is the highest of all. Um, and the fifth one, on a related note, that you would make less money in the UK than in the US. But again, with a lower cost of living in most cities, things balance out, things kind of even out. So I don't think you necessarily need to make quite as much money there when you have a lower cost of living involved. So that's good to know. It does make me think it might be interesting to think about what possibilities that could be for me to spend some time living in the UK. And then finally, uh, uh, that British food is really bad. Because again, I have heard that rumor too, and it's kind of funny that this was an American debunking this and sort of poking fun at us, saying that, by the way, we're the home of fast food. But anyway, so that's all the myths about the UK that I wanted to go over the debunking of a little bit because I am familiar with all of these parts of the reputation of the UK that are floating around America. But I'd say, yeah, it's time for me to go investigate their culture a little more. Anyway, so before I move over to the two things that are a little more political that have to do with the, Epstein Saga and the reinjection of that into popular media over this last week, does anybody have any more comments about any things that we Americans think about what life must be like in the U.S.? Whether you're talking a myth or something that you know for sure to be true, I would love to hear it. That would be super interesting. And I'm sure, yeah, I would definitely share it again. And with anybody who's not reading the chat, I would like to, yeah, help keep this conversation going if you have any particular ideas. No, I don't think I'm seeing any chat. I am trying to keep up with the chat much better this time than usual, so that's good. But okay, so if I'm not seeing any more thoughts about reputation of the UK or myths about the UK or anything, so now let's move on to the unfortunate Epstein saga and how it's been re-injected into the media a couple times this week by a couple people. And I guess first let's talk about how Pam Bondi is supposedly not going to testify before Congress, even though she was subpoenaed by the Judiciary Committee for the 14th, which is going to be on Tuesday, this coming Tuesday. And so there's a subpoena, and it's not just for document production, it's for testimony. And so, and this is not Pam Bondi or her personal attorney who is putting up the roadblock behind this. It's actually the Department of Justice. I think that they're trying to throw up a roadblock, which looks especially suspicious, especially to those who who do believe the American government is hiding a bunch of stuff, is doing the Epstein cover up and whatnot, which I think would be the majority of people, but it does seem to be a bipartisan issue, release all the files and whatnot. Anyway, and and so it's not her or her personal attorney, not Bondi or her personal attorney who's throwing up this roadblock. It's the Department of Justice. And they're saying that this subpoena is not really valid because she's not the Attorney General anymore. And that would make some sense to me if the subpoena was for her to be supplying documents. And I would think, okay, in that case, maybe the person who is currently serving in the role of Attorney General, who would, of course, be Todd Blanche. He's the sort of acting Attorney General. I don't think, well, he's not been putting in a permanent way, but he's acting. But it's not like the Department of Justice actually offered up Todd Blanche either. They just said no, Pam Bondi shouldn't have to testify because it's your subpoena is not valid anymore because she's not AG. But that's not how I've heard a lot of the legal analysis of this going, because if you're subpoenaed to testify, and we're talking in front of Congress, not in court, but still, if you're subpoenaed to testify in front of Congress, it doesn't matter so much what your job title was on the day you got subpoenas versus what your job title is or who your employer is on the day that you would actually testify, right? Either way, this subpoena was for an individual named Pam Bondi, and so it should still apply. Anyway, so that's the one thing. And to me, this is kind of gotta be annoying the Trumps, who would rather, I think, see the whole Epstein thing go away because this has been a pretty kind of political kryptonite for Donald Trump, since he's known as the person named in those files more times than anybody except Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell. Um, and so I'm sure he would like to see it go away. But now, uh, with Pam Bondi potentially not testifying before Congress, that brings up another big scandal, right? Anyway, and so that's well, all I really want to say about Pam Bondi or the Department of Justice for now. So on to the other thing. I don't know how many of you watched this statement made by Melania Trump yesterday, which was Thursday, April 9th. And I did. I watched it. Actually, I watched it quite a few times. It wasn't very long. It was about only like 6 minutes long. So I wanted to make sure I was absorbing every detail. Uh, and it was a pretty interesting statement. But one thing about it is she's calling for a congressional hearing so that the Epstein victims would testify before Congress. And that seems like a good thing to pitch, because who doesn't want justice for the victims, and who doesn't want the victims to have their, or I shouldn't call them victims, let's call them survivors. That's a lot better nomenclature in my opinion. But Epstein survivors, yeah, should be able to tell their story if they want. And one thing Melania said was that it would have the power of being under oath, and so that's good and all that, but people aren't reacting to it so great, because a lot of people are saying, well, the victims, I mean, the survivors, um, they have done their part in telling their stories to the FBI and to other investigators, and they've been pushing for the government to move forward with all of this and exposing all the people who are involved in all that. And so a lot of those folks are getting, well, mad at Melania and saying, "How dare you push it back on us? You know, how dare you push it back on the victims? Just have the government do its job and prosecute already." And that to me is interesting. And I think probably the majority of her time was spent saying, "Oh, people are lying about me." She's saying people are lying about her. She didn't name all that many, well, specific names. She did say a couple um, journals and outlets that had to retract their so-called lies because she's saying she started off with, and the exact quote she says, "The lies linking me with the disgraceful Jeffrey Epstein need to end today." So I think that's where she was going with a lot of it. And I gotta wonder if there's some story that she's trying to get out in front of. Um, and and by lies, I would imagine that Michael Wolff is at least one of the journalists she's talking about who she would like us all to believe that what he has reported as lies. Because just to recap, he's an American journalist. He contributes for USA Today, and I think also the Hollywood Reporter, something like that. Um, and he's he reported that Epstein was the one who introduced Donald Trump to Melania. That was one thing he reported, and now she's saying that's a lie. And he also reported that the first time the two of them made love, I'm talking the Trumps, the president and the first lady, was on Epstein's private jet. And now she's saying that no, she's never been on his private jet and she's never been to his island and she had no knowledge of his crimes and that she barely knew the guy. She basically didn't really know him. Um, and that highly contradicts a lot of what Michael Wolff has reported. And little recap of who he is. In addition to being one of the people reporting that Epstein introduced Donald Trump to Melania, and that the first time they made love was on Epstein's jet. That's again things I've heard from his reporting. He also he says he recorded about 100 hours of interviews with Jeffrey Epstein over the course of several years, and specifically regarding Epstein's assessment of and relationship with Donald Trump. So I can totally see why the Trumps wouldn't want anybody to hear from Michael Wolff. And it does, yeah, it does make you wonder, okay, so who are you going to believe? This reporter who's basing his reports on things reported by Jeffrey Epstein? So you're going to believe the words coming out of Jeffrey Epstein's mouth, or that did back when he made the recording? Or are you going to believe Melania Trump, the First Lady? And I would like to think that in general we would be inclined to believe the First Lady, but then again, the Trumps are not exactly known for being completely honest. Um, and oh yeah, Sunshine, that's a good point. You're saying coming from her, that feels more like a threat, as in exposing their identities, more than it sounds like an opportunity to tell one story. Huh. Oh, you're talking about the survivors and everything like that. Huh. That's interesting, and I hadn't really thought of it that way exactly, but that does seem interesting to me and possible. But I think, I mean, to me, it sounds a little more, bit more like she knows about some possible new reporting that's going to come out that she's trying to get in front of. So it makes me wonder, what the heck might she be aware of that will be coming out soon? Like, is Michael Wolff going to release some audio recordings, some of the audio that he recorded with Jeffrey Epstein uh, that's gonna prove Melania incorrect or dishonest about all that. I don't know. But anyway, to me, the funniest thing about this to me was that I'm like, isn't Melania kind of stabbing Donald Trump in the back right now by calling for a congressional hearing over this? Because wouldn't he just want it to go away? I don't know. To me, that's what it seems like to me. And if I know if I were Donald Trump, I would probably want this to go away. But of course, I'm not him, and I would. Um, yeah, I've never known anybody even like him either. So who the heck knows? And but yeah, so on top of saying the lies linking me to Jeffrey Epstein have to end, and she also said she's never been on his private jet, which means there's no way the first time she made love to Donald was there, if that's true. And she's also saying that he didn't introduce the two of them because the first time she met Jeffrey Epstein was in the year 2000 at some party she and Donald Trump had both attended together, whereas how they met was by chance at a party in New York City in 1998. I mean, by they, I mean how Donald and Melania met was by chance at a party in 1998, and then Melania didn't meet Jeffrey Epstein until 2 years after that, apparently in the year 2000. And so again, makes me wonder who to believe exactly. And I also did like the fact that she said very clearly, "I am not Epstein's victim." She is saying she is not a victim. She did not participate in any way in any of the crimes, and she didn't even have any knowledge of the crime. So it sounds like a bunch of denying. But to me, I don't know if there was a good reason for all that statement. Uh, if the Trump's goal would be to make the Epstein saga kind of go away, why keep on injecting it into the media like that? And oh, she did talk about how she detailed her meeting with Donald Trump in her book, Melania. If you already own it or anything like that, you might have read it in there or something. And also, another notable thing about this is why I think that Melania must be referring to Michael Wolff as one of the so called liars about her is because she's threatened him with $1 billion lawsuit for defamation. Because again, she's claiming a lot of his reporting are lies, and so defamation against her and her reputation. And again, I don't know if he's reporting on conversations he had with Jeffrey Epstein. I gotta wonder exactly how truthful that guy would have been, specifically if the recordings were regarding his relationship with Donald Trump and his assessment of Donald Trump, because even back then, Donald Trump was quite the celebrity, and maybe Epstein was making stuff up to just get more clout over that. I don't know. I don't know. I don't know. I don't know. But anyway, so yeah, I don't want to get into too much more politics, but I figured a little of the Epstein scandal. This is it's more tabloid type stuff than anything else, so it does qualify as culture. And yeah, and I'm glad I did get to spend like the first half hour talking about myths that Americans believe about the UK. And I'm glad I finally found one video and then several other written resources to confirm that these myths are not so true. And Yeah, that's a good point too, Sunshine. Really, her reputation is worth $1 billion? Huh. Huh. I don't know. Uh, I suppose that's a matter of opinion, I guess, or a matter of perspective. You know, if I were her, I would probably more value my reputation a lot higher um, than being me and valuing her reputation. But that's another thing. And plus, she is the first lady of the U.S., so um, so reputation's important in that way. Anyway, so yeah, that's pretty much everything I wanted to talk about tonight, and it's been 50 minutes already. So yeah, this is even a little longer than I thought this would last. So sorry if I was boring anybody for too long, but thank you anyway for watching. I do appreciate that so much. And of course, like usual, as soon as I close this live stream, YouTube is going to make it privatized again. And so I will go in the studio and make it public lickety split, like within 10 seconds. So if anybody wants to end up leaving a comment or anything, maybe that will work out better for them. But thanks again for hanging out with me and listening to my ramblings about culture. And yeah, and oh, if you want to learn more about language and culture, please do consider subscribing to the channel. And please do give this video a like, whether you're watching it on the live stream or on the replay. That's always appreciated. And since you're now around for the very end, thank you so much for watching the video to the very end. It does make a big difference in the YouTube algorithm, so I appreciate that so much. And so that's all I got for tonight. And so, yeah. Oh, and by the way, I wanted to mention the new shorts series that I'm doing. It's called French Lessons du Jour. And so each French lesson du jour, I'm just teaching one or two little words. And so far it's going pretty well and people are watching, so I will keep putting out more. And pretty soon I will get around to making a more long form content video, not about teaching French specifically, but something else linguistic. But I guess you'll have to wait and see. And yeah, so thanks again, and I will catch you around next time. Bye bye.